Okay, so just warning you now, I have a cold. I have water, so if I cough or anything, I'm really, really sorry. I don't mean to, it just happens. Also, I'm not very good at talking, like doing projects oral, even though I'm doing it over the computer and to myself, really, which I'm sorry for because I'm probably gonna get really awkward. Um, but um, during this culminating activity and during this whole entire course, I learned quite a bit. And I had already taken a course at my school, which is really poorly named, but I learned about residential schools and I learned about different things that have to do with natives and um, I learned quite a bit, not only through that course, but this one as well. And during my culminating activity and the research I did, I realized that life on reserves, while they are kind of the same with the people and how they act and such, as people off of reserves, there's a difference. And it's not something that is a recent sort of occurrence. It's something that has transpired and developed and somewhat snowballed over hundreds of years. It kind of always, not always, it kind of started when the Europeans came here to Canada and they took the land and they tried to assimilate and alienate the natives from both their culture, their people, everything. And as Canada kind of grew into this country, its hate for the Indigenous grew as well. And that's where residential schools came in. And going back and doing all this research, I kind of realized that that kind of stemmed a lot of things. Because what our forefathers kind of did was put this stigma, okay, to natives. And as much as I really hate to say it, it goes through generations. I mean, some people can break it, some people don't have to think that way, but it goes through generations. And that, I think, is what ended up happening when the idea for residential schools came about. I'm not a very big fan of those. I don't know many people who are. I really don't think why, I don't understand why they even came about, but well, they do, but still. I think that a lot of the issues that are stemming or that are going on today on reservations kind of stem from residential schools, because what ended up happening was you have the government saying, oh yeah, these are our people now, we're going to teach them the Christian ways, we're going to make sure that they don't have a culture other than Christianity, they don't know their own, they don't know their native language, they know French or English. And basically what ended up happening was all of these children and teenagers, like all of these kids, went into these schools, which was run by the churches, and they were kind of forced to give up everything they knew. And it's the treatment that of the children that went on in there is despicable. Going slightly off topic, there's well, not really, but sort of. There's a documentary called We Are Children, or We Were the Children, that I watched in this class at my school, and hold on. It followed, I think I speak about it in my essay. Can't really remember, I have sick brain. It followed these two residential school survivors. And they were talking about how, they were fed oatmeal constantly, which doesn't do anything for you. So obviously you're setting children up for being weak and being not as strong or able as they could be. And there was a lot of abuse, both verbal, physical, mentally. Like there was just a lot of abuse. They were treated like, this is a horrible term, Neanderthals, like they didn't know anything. And there's this story where this little girl got sick. I can't remember if it was because of the oatmeal, which she called mush, if I believe I'm remembering correctly, or if she just got sick. But she was in the infirmary, and one of the priests that ran the school went in and sexually abused her. And that was just one case. There were so many people who were abused in that sort of way. And it's unfortunate because that happened, and then there were children who were not taken care of properly, and they got an illness in their lungs and they couldn't breathe, and some of them were killed because of overcrowding. Like that happened at the Brantford school, which is like 30 minutes away from where I live. And a lot of the issues that are going on reserves stem from that, because when you graduate from those schools, you know, you're supposed to have a somewhat normal life, which I think is reaching. You know, they weren't offered any sort of help through therapy. And so what ends up happening is you have two people, both residential school survivors, both have gone through horrible things. They come together, they get married, they have kids. Like a good portion of the time, there's lots of alcohol abuse, there is verbal or sexual abuse, and then they have kids. And that kind of, the cycle of abuse kind of continues. And so, it goes through the generations. And as much as, you know, people can get help, people can reach out, it's kind of evident that, you know, through generations, there has been this deterioration of happiness and health, and it goes on, and it's a cycle. And yeah, people can break it, but it's something that happens. And you know, as much as it happens outside of reserves, it's much more popular. And there are people who, you know, go through their life and they can come out on the good side of it, or you know, they can learn to deal with it. Some of them can't. And some Indigenous people, they, you know, abuse alcohol, or they abuse other people, or they kill people, which happens, and that's why there are so many murdered and missing Aboriginal women. Not to say that there aren't missing men either, but and you know, they live in poverty, and that is more so to blame on the government than it is the people. The government has always had a lack of funding for reserves. There is a lack of vigor on the government's part to make sure that reserves are being treated properly. I can't pronounce the name of it, so I'm not going to butcher it. But there's a reserve in Ontario, and I speak about this reserve in my essay, that has such poor water conditions that they've been boiling their water for 2 decades. I don't remember ever getting a water advisory in my 19 years of life. Like here, where I live, I've never gotten one. And the fact that there are people who've gone almost my whole entire life, they have gone my whole entire life, boiling water is horrible. And it's not just the water conditions, it's education. Education through the years has gotten better on reserves, but has not always been fantastic. Um, there's just been a lot of neglect on the government's part for reserves, and that's a really big issue. Like, people are living in homes that needed repairs 25 years ago, and they're not getting paid as much because there's not much work on reserves, and they have to travel outside of reserves, and there's just a lot of different things that go into the equation. It's like one of those really long equations that you get in math, like a squared plus b squared equals 11c plus 10x, that kind of stuff. And it's all in this big equation, and it lands up to life on reserve. And while that kind of happens and transpires in everyday life off of reserves, it's worse on reserves. And, you know, there are certain reserves which are bad, like really bad, depending on what you're looking at. Like, the worst reserves for water are in Ontario and Manitoba. I don't know why, but it's the truth. But if you look at other reserves in Canada, they're all bad at something, or they're all ranking, well, they're not bad in something, but they're all ranking poorly in something. And so it's neglect on the government's part. And the chiefs have tried to branch out to the government, and I don't want to say that Trudeau is going to fix everything, because I don't know. I like Trudeau, and it seems like he's actually trying to, you know, go in the right direction, whereas Harper didn't. We'll have to see, because there needs to be action done in order to help Canada's reserves. They're not in great standing, and frankly, you know, there are a lot of things that can be done and need to be done and should have been done years ago in order to help the people that live on reserves. And you can't really pinpoint which one is the worst, because there are certain things in which each reserve ranks poorly at, and then there are some who are pretty good. It just depends on where you are. I mean, there has been action in order to help reserves. I mean, the government has given money out. There has been money given, but money can only go so far. If you have a 20 to 30 year water problem, money, $500,000, isn't going to fix that right away. It's not going to fix that. You need lots of time and money. And I think that's something that the government really needs to work on. But there has been, you know, funds given, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's something that's come up a lot lately with the government. And I'm really happy about that. And the government's recognizing residential schools, and it's recognizing what they did, and it's recognizing, you know, what needs to be done, and that's fantastic. Another thing that's been happening, because Trudeau came into power, there's going to be more inquiries on the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is something that needed to be done years ago, because some of the oldest cases were in the 1960s, which is what, 40 years ago? Not very good at math right now. I apologize. But that's kind of going on, and there are certain things that are going on right now, which is really good to help fix what has been going on reserves, which is fantastic. But I don't know. I think that the government needs to work quickly, very quickly, and I think that there needs to be more done. I don't know. I can't really pinpoint what, other than, you know, more money needs to be put in, more care, more checks need to be done on reserves to make sure that not only that things are going the way they should, but that the money is being spent properly, that the money is going to certain things that will benefit the reserve. Because who knows, you could have someone in power who's abusing the money. You never know. It doesn't have to be a chief, it could be someone who's doling out the money. That's just something that could happen. But I feel like that could help. And I think that there needs to be more education for those who don't live on reserves. Because there are a lot of things that I learned not only this year, but in my class that I took at my school that I didn't know before I got into high school. And I mean, granted, I was away a lot as a kid, but because I was sick. But there's just not a lot of education going, not a lot of effort going into educating people who aren't native on what happens on reserves or what native culture is. I mean, sure, in some schools it's an elective and you can take it, but it's not something that's mandatory. And considering, sorry, that was my table. Considering that, you know, the natives were here first, I feel like it should be a mandatory subject. And I feel like we should be taught what happens and the culture. We should be taught the culture and the religion because there is a creator and there are certain things the creator does, and the stories, you know, the stories are a key part of native culture, and I feel like that should be something that we're taught to help kind of make us understand. And I think that we also, people off of reserves, need to be taught certain things like what is Indian status, because I don't know that. I didn't know that till I got into like this course and my other course. Like my dad, I remember asking my dad about it a couple years ago, and he didn't know what it was. He just sort of passed it aside and said, oh, they get free stuff. Not really the case. So there's a stigma to it. And I think that if the government were to make classes about natives mandatory, I feel like that would raise more awareness as to what was going on and what happened, and more people would want to help. More people would want to go and, you know, live on reserve, or, you know, help pay more taxes or pay into a fund so that reserves can get back up on their feet and get it so that there's not as much poverty on reserves. And I think that's something that needs to happen. And yeah, I don't know. I just know that the research I did for this culminating opened my eyes quite a bit. It may not seem like it because I'm sick and I have sick brain and I'm not very articulate right now, but it did open my eyes, and this course really made me more open-minded and more educated, and I would probably take this again if there was like a next step. It was just a really good course and I learned a lot, and I think that the culminating activity helped me learn a lot also. Like, I just learned quite a bit. But yeah, I think that there are certain things that need to be done, and hopefully within, you know, the next couple years, things start turning around for like the government and their treatment towards people on reserves and people on reserves in general. But yeah, that was my really horrible oral project for this course. I'm really sorry if I didn't make any sense. I tried. Thank you again for teaching me. I had a really good time, and yeah.